title and think, what in the heck does this have to do with Macon, Georgia? But I assure you there's a strong connection, as you will hear. Several of you will remember about 10 years ago I did 2 books about American women who married titled husbands. And ever since that time I've kept sort of a running total of all of these women whenever there's a reference. So I came across a reference to a German baroness, and it said Macon, Georgia, and I went, no, I don't quite think so. So I did a lot of digging, and that's sort of where this story began. So I will also tell you that last week I gave a shortened version of this to the DAR, and one of the members is here, so I hope that you'll learn a few new things at any rate. And can you see over there? I'm sorry about the... Okay, thanks. The man up in the top left is Darius Holbrook, Holbrook. That's his wife down below and his daughter on the right. He was from Massachusetts, made a great deal of money in textiles, and then after that moved to New York, sort of got into real estate, became one of the backers of the transatlantic telegraph wire that was all the way across the ocean for us. Made a great deal of money, and he had only one child, and that's the daughter Caroline, or Carrie, as we refer to her. He, in one fell swoop, bought 2.5 million acres of land in Virginia, West Virginia, and what was to become Kentucky. Bought it sight unseen, bought it from someone in London, and that huge fortune would become really sort of an onus on his daughter, because it preceded her, the reputation of being this great heiress, as you'll hear. But at any rate, as I said, they moved to New York, but she was sort of restless. She was never considered the daughter of a beautiful woman, but she was a great conversationalist. And 2 of her mother's brothers were Episcopal priests, and one of them was in Mobile, Alabama. And Mobile, this was just before the war. It was sort of a great social place. Some of you may know that even its Mardi Gras, is 15 years older than the city of New Orleans itself. At any rate, so she decided she would go down and spend a few months living with her uncle, and that's what she did. Well, she came on the scene, and the most eligible bachelor in town was named William Chandler, very wealthy. His parents had come from Georgia, by the way. They were from Washington, Wilkes County. And his father had given one of the speeches that led to the founding of Wesleyan College, because while he was in Athens, he gave a lecture about the fact that we needed to have education for women as well. And it was that speech that led partially to the founding. Well, anyway, here comes this northern girl, wealthy, of course, and what does she do? She promptly goes after the #1 marital catch in town, and she snags him, William Chandler. This was his parents' home on Government Street, the top and bottom left. When I showed that picture to Vince Dooley, who some of you will know as the University of Georgia former football coach, he's a great friend and also a great historian, but he grew up in Mobile. And he went to that house when it was a school. It was a Catholic school. And he said that years later, when he went back and looked in the back in what was the yard, he couldn't believe that was their football field, baseball field, and basketball field. He said it just looked so tiny. But anyway, this was the Chandler home, and they gave the young couple a house just 2 blocks away, down here on the bottom right. It's also gone as well, but it was, as I said, just 2 blocks away. So anyway, they enter, married life, very, very prosperous, very happy. Promptly had a little boy, and then she was pregnant, and he became quite ill, her husband. He was only in his early 30s at this point, but to be safe, he wrote his will, and he wrote a curious line in it. He said that should he die, he hopes that his wife will go north to her family. Now, I'm not quite sure, I don't know if he meant that she knew it would be too hot for her there, or perhaps more likely, she would not be terribly welcome, since all of the young women in the town didn't like her. But for whatever reason, he died, and she was 7 months pregnant at the time. Now, I have to sort of jump ahead a bit in the story to tell you that, since you know from the title there's going to be a murder story, it's the daughter of the woman we're talking about. Well, suddenly, when that happened, 20 years in the future, all of these terrible stories were written about the mother. They said, oh, well, this girl learned how to murder from her mother because her mother murdered her own husband. And even the Mobile paper printed a story saying that she wouldn't let anyone come near him, that only she doctor him, and that she had left 2 children at home. Remember, she was 7 months pregnant. She had left 2 children at home while she went out partying in the evening. With whom? What men could she have gone out partying in, particularly in that situation? But at any rate, it was the kind of thing that would follow her. But after that story was printed, several family members and friends came to the paper and said, that's just not true, we were there. So what did the paper do? 3 days later, it printed a tiny little retraction on the inside. So that story, of course, would come to be reprinted over and over and over, but never the retraction, of course. So that was sort of the beginning of the fall. So anyway, her husband's buried here, William Chandler. He did have a younger brother, by the way, who had 2 daughters, but they never married. So he really was the only one who could sort of carry on this family. And as I said, he already had a son, and now the daughter, and she's sort of waiting to have him after the death. So here she waits 2 months. She has a little girl, finally, Flory, who's the one we're going to be talking about. And did she take her husband's advice about going north to her family? No, she didn't. Where did she go, though? Macon, Georgia. Absolutely. And of course, you have to ask yourself why. I mean, what was there in Macon that would have possibly drawn her here? Perhaps her uncles would have had some connection to Christ Church. Maybe the rector there. That's one possibility. But one thing we do know is that she had become acquainted with a naval officer when they were in Mobile, and he was stationed in Pensacola, which is about 60 miles south of Mobile. But at any rate, his name was Franklin Bache Dubarry. He was from a very prominent family. In fact, he was Benjamin Franklin's grandson. He also was a French Viscount. And he was one of 6 sons, 4 of whom fought for the Union. In fact, his eldest brother, who was a West Point graduate, became a very prominent general in the war. But Franklin and his next oldest brother came south. They both gave up their commissions in the north, came south. He was a naval officer. Obviously very handsome, I'm told. Unfortunately, I've never found a photograph of him, but he also supposedly had a beautiful singing voice. And whenever he would go to parties, people would always ask him to sing. Well, I'm certain that she must have met him, of course, when he was in Pensacola. But again, when the daughter's murder trial happens, all of these stories say, she was having an affair with him. Everyone in Mobile knew it, and she was out running around with him every night. Well, again, he was a naval officer, and he's in Pensacola.
He died in 1862, correct?
Right.
So that was during the Civil War.
Yes.
Well, Mobile was also was a large Confederate naval presence there as well.
Absolutely.
So it made very much sense that a naval officer could meet someone from Mobile there.
Well, you have to remember too, Mardi Gras season, parties every night for about 6 weeks. He was a handsome, bright officer stationed just down in Pensacola.
Dashing with good voice.
Exactly. And so I assume he would have been invited up to Mobile to parties and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so she comes to Macon. Now, years later, when the daughter's story comes up, the Macon paper has a story in which it says, Carrie came to Macon and at once rented a house on Mulberry Street where she lived a life of luxury and ease. The dashing captain soon found that his admiration for the lady was greater than ever, and as a natural consequence, the Mulberry Street mansion became his headquarters. Now, 1863, when they come here, what kind of entertaining would they be doing? And another point, it mentions a mansion on Mulberry Street. Don't know which one that might have been. But what we do know is that she and Captain Dubarry married. And it was 1 year and 2 weeks after she was widowed. Again, the future stories would say things like within days of being widowed, she fell into his arms and they were, the socially correct thing to do would be to wait at least a year. She waited 1 year and 2 weeks. And now what was he doing here in Macon specifically? Why had he been brought here? Well, most of you know the Confederate Armory was downtown, sort of near where the jail is now. But there was something called the laboratory, an armory laboratory that was being built. And since most of you are from Macon, I'll do the directions we always do. When you go at Lionel Avenue, where Jim Shaw's is on the left side. On the right side, there's a plaque that talks about the Confederate laboratory. So you would think that was where the laboratory was, right? It wasn't. It was behind Jim Shaw's, across the railroad track, and what became a big creosote plant there. But obviously, if the sign had been over there, no one would have seen it. Well, anyway, that's what he was brought here for. He was specifically requested. Major Tyler, who ran the armory, specifically requested him to be brought here to be in charge of building that. And of course, he had to work around the clock, which makes you also wonder, well, what kind of entertaining were they doing in this mansion on Mulberry Street if he was entertaining all the time? But they did in fact marry, and unfortunately, that's an older photograph of Carrie. I really wish I had one that were younger, but I don't. But this is Christ Church, as you can see. They were married there. It's the oldest church in continuous use in Macon, and their license is down here. When I searched about a year ago for the actual book, it was missing, but there is microfilm at the library, and so that's actually taken from the microfilm. But interestingly enough, the priest who married them was Reverend Henry Rees, R-E-E-S, who had been referred to as a prince of missionaries. He was the son of a wealthy banker in Darien, Georgia. First had been a Presbyterian minister, then he became an Episcopal minister, and he was rector at Christ Church from 1855 to 1869. And by the way, during that time, he also married Mary Day and Sidney Lanier. See the tiny little wedding dress over there? But then he established the second Episcopal church here at St. Paul's, and was rector there. And in retirement, he went home to Darien, Georgia, which is where he ended up and was buried there. But as I said, Major Tyler, who was head of the laboratory, had specifically requested that Captain Duberry be brought here to superintend the building. Unfortunately, his health was not good, the captain, and after they had been together only a few months, at first he was ordered to Charleston for service by General Beauregard, but he said his health was evidently so bad at that time that he asked for a 6-month leave of absence. So he and his new wife and the 2 little children went up to Richmond, Virginia. From there, they went down to Wilmington, North Carolina, which was where the best place to run the blockade if you were trying to leave in a ship. They were able to do so. They got away. 2 days later, at sea, he died. She was widowed twice in 22 months' time. And later, you know what's coming, right? Later, all the stories said, well, she obviously murdered him too. She done it to the first one, she done it to the second one, and there was even a story that was printed, including in the Macon paper, much later, that said that the captain had desperately wanted to turn around to go back to get medical care for Captain Duberry, but that she had refused.
She refused, oh no.
Exactly. Well, obviously, if you just escaped the blockade, you're not going to turn around anyway and go directly into the Union fleet that's waiting there. Plus, two of the officers who were on board at the time wrote that she did everything possible for him, that she was terribly loving and caring, and that she was devastated when he died, and of course he was buried at sea. So anyway, they get all the way over to England, which is where they had been headed. And she sort of was at loose ends at this point. Here she is with 2 little children. She still has this supposed fortune, but her father has died since then, but her mother is still there, and she's in New York. She held all the purse strings, and she basically said, come home. And so Carrie and the 2 little children went back to New York, and while they were there, Carrie became a close friend of this woman, and notice I said woman, her name is Frank Crawford. And the reason for that is that when her mother was pregnant, her father promised his law partner, we will name the new baby for you. And when the baby was born, they named her Frank. But the reason that she was rather prominent, she's from Mobile as well. Her mother was a prominent Mobile resident who was a first cousin of Commodore Vanderbilt's first wife. All this is terribly interrelated. At any rate, so when Commodore Vanderbilt becomes widowed, he's elderly, very, very wealthy. At the time, he was the wealthiest man in the country. He wanted to marry again, and he was courting her mother. And everyone expected him to ask the mother to marry him. He asked the daughter. 25 and she was 30. And she said no. She was relatively wealthy in her own right, but she couldn't imagine marrying into that family. The Commodore was not a particularly elegant man. That's probably the best way to put it. He was sort of the first generation. He had just made the money and all that. But they continued, and so she finally said yes. They went off to Canada to be married and came back. And at the time, the Commodore was asked, why did you ask her to marry you instead of the mother? And he said, well, if I'd asked the mother, Frank would have gotten married to someone else, and now I have both of them. So remember now, here's Carrie. She's got some money, but her mother's controlling it. She's got 2 little kids. She's a close friend of Frank's and was often there. And during one of the times that she was there, one of her cousins was married to a Methodist minister named McTire or McTeer. I'm not sure which of the 2 ways it's pronounced correctly. And they came up to see them and talked to the Commodore about endowing a university in his name. And he had never been to the South, but he was very proud of his wife's Southern heritage and legacy. And she said to him, so much has been done for the Northern officers, but the South really has nothing. Won't you please endow a university in the South? He agreed. First said $500,000, then it went up to $1 million. It's the largest gift ever given, a philanthropic gift in the country. And of course, they insisted on naming it for him, Vanderbilt University, and it was to go in Mobile. But Mobile had yellow fever outbreak at the time. And they said they had feared because it was so low that would continue, and so they instead put it in Nashville, Tennessee. And of course, that was what we know today, of course, as Vanderbilt University, as I said, named in his honor. Well, anyway, at this point, Carrie goes back to Europe. She sort of went back and forth several times. It's hard to keep up with her. But she got ahead of the task of all the American women who started marrying titled husbands, right? Well, she marries one. She marries a German baron named Adolf von Roques, R-O-Q-U-E-S, here in the middle here and over there. He obviously expected, he'd heard about her great fortune. He obviously expected that. She expected his great social position and his family castle and all those kind of things. They were both immensely disappointed. He didn't have a castle. She didn't know that unlike in the British system, for example, only the eldest son has the title. In the German system, they all did. So he was a younger son, was a military officer, really didn't have much. And so they really both got the worst of the bargain. But they never, at one point he even beat her, and they know that happened because she came for help and all that sort of thing, but they never divorced. So to her death, she was called the Baroness von Roques. And she wrote on crested stationery, so she did at least get something out of Now, on one of the trips back from the United States back to England, one of the officers on board was General Hazard. He'd been a Union general, very dashing. He had moved his cotton brokering business to New Orleans after the war. And so he knew one of the young men on the ship, who was down here, James Mabry, because he was a cotton broker with offices in Norfolk, Virginia, and in Liverpool, England. And while he was on board, of course, you've got Carrie, the mother, but you've also got Florrie, the 17-year-old daughter, with all this talk of fortune, all of these millions of dollars. And so General Hazard introduced the two, and by the time they landed in London, they, of course, decided that they would get married. Later stories again said that Carrie pushed this, that she wanted her daughter to have someone who was prominent and all that sort of thing. No, I've seen the correspondence in which she was against it, as a matter of fact. And also, he was her mother's exact age. The new husband was. So they get to London, and they promptly announced their marriage. They were married here. This is in London. But see, what she didn't know were 2 very important things about him. One, he had a mistress by whom he already had 3 children. And he knew, she, by the way, thought that she was his wife. She, on the census records and her Bible, she always used that last name. She always thought that she really was the wife. But she also didn't know that he was, at the time, what was called an arsenic eater. He was completely addicted to arsenic, And the problem with arsenic is that you have to take more and more and more of it in order for it to be effective. And so he was dosing himself 5 and 6 times a day with arsenic.
What's the purpose of eating arsenic?
For energy and an aphrodisiac. That was what was believed at the time. But again, he became addicted to it. And he was also a hypochondriac. He would go to 3 doctors in 3 days and get a prescription for one, and then go the next day to someone else and not tell them and get a different prescription. And he was absolutely known for that. Anyway, the two of them marry, and they go off to Liverpool and to Norfolk. They lived 6 months in each of the 2 places. And he kept waiting for this huge fortune to appear. Meanwhile, the grandmother had died, and so they assumed, of course, that Carrie, had all this money. Well, it was land. It wasn't cash. And they hadn't even been paying taxes on it. So she hired a couple of American attorneys and said, I'll split it half with you. If you can get it, you can have half and I'll take the other half. But that still would have been, a huge fortune nonetheless. So he's upset that that's not happening. She finds out, of course, that he has a mistress. And by the way, he had 2 more children by her after their marriage. She had a total of 5. These were their 2 children, Gladys and Bobo. And after the birth of the second one, when she learned, she did not know about the mistress until then. And when she learned that after the birth, she barred him from her bedroom, and they did not share a bedroom after that. It was a sort of a tense relationship at home. Now, just to recap, so you'll know where we are. We've got the Holbrooks up top, and then Caroline over here on the left, and she had married Franklin DuBarry, and then Baron Adolph von Rotz. Chandler had been her husband. You've got the 2. Holbrook was the son, and then Flory, whom we're talking about, who marries James Maybrick, and then they have the 2 children down here, Bobo and Gladys. Now, Flory was also considered a great beauty. She was. The face looks a little too full, but she had beautiful violet eyes that were always smiling. But she also was not very bright. Her own mother wrote of her, she is a woman of little penetration. And that's the mother speaking of her only daughter. Anyway, but she loved fine clothes and all that. So she started borrowing money from her own mother, who couldn't really afford it because she didn't have that much money. So she started borrowing from moneylenders in London. Meanwhile, the husband wasn't making very much money because he kept expecting all this money to come in, but his arsenic habit was getting very, very expensive. He not only had it delivered to his office, he would stop by a chemist about 4 or 5 times a day, and all this was testified to in the eventual trial. So this is all certain. He also kept it in his pocket, and as he was walking along, he would just have some as well. Strychnine as well, several things. So all this was going on at the same time. Now, here's a strange twist of it. At the time, arsenic was also used for beauty, for complexion, and it was well known for that. You could buy arsenic wafers. You could get prescriptions, and Flory had a prescription for it, but she misplaced it after her trial. It was found actually in their Bible. But at any rate, the other way that women who didn't have a lot of money at the time were able to get arsenic, they would buy flypaper strips, and soak them in water because they were arsenic. And then they could use the arsenic that came off the flypaper for their complexion. It does build up in your system. In fact, one of the most beautiful society leaders in London was the wife of the 6th Earl of Coventry, and she actually died of it. She was considered such a great beauty, and she wouldn't stop, and so she actually died, I think, at 28 or 29.
Maybrick didn't just die a natural death. I mean,
Well, the reason I mention this is because it certainly figures into the story. the midst of all this, Flory decides, look, if my husband can have a mistress, he can have 5 children, if there can be no consequences for it, then I should be able to enjoy myself as well. So at a dinner party at her own house, she met this man named Alfred Brierly. He was also a cotton broker. He'd been invited to this dinner party. And the two of them started having a relationship. And she, in a very, I've never known whether she was just this dumb, excuse me, or if she maybe were trying to start a divorce proceeding. But she called the hotel, telegraphed the hotel in London where all of the cotton traders lived when they were in London, booked a reservation for Mr. and Mrs. Maybrick, and then went to the hotel for 2 nights with him. Openly seen. I mean, didn't try to hide it in any way. At the trial, they even had people like the waiters testifying, yes, I came into their room and they were together and all that. So, anyway, she started divorce proceedings, but then she went to see an attorney who said to her, you will lose your 2 children forever. You will never, the laws are completely against you. You'll never see them again if you do this. You just need to go home and work it out. The attorney told me. So, she did go back home. She apologized to her husband. He supposedly accepted her apology. But a couple of days later, they were out at the races, at the national races, and for the future Edward VII. Then Prince of Wales was there as well. It was a big event. He kept dosing himself. People saw him taking it out of his pocket. He got really angry because he saw Flory holding hands with Brierly. And he hit her in full view of everyone else. When they got home that night, he told her she had to leave the house, but he was sort of falling over at this point because he had so much. And one of the maids convinced him, let her stay till morning, you know, just where's she going to go at this time of night, that sort of thing. So the next morning, she was still there, but she'd been badly beaten. He'd obviously gotten up during the night and really beaten his wife badly. And at that point, she decided she was going to leave him. She called an attorney as well. And at the same time, she said to one of the doctors, and this was in the trial, so it's got to be true, she said, I'm so worried because of all this medicine he's taking, and I think he's killing himself with it, and I think this is all lending itself to what's happening. And the doctor said, oh, no, he's fine. And then he said, and if he dies, just tell him that you talked to me and it's okay. He literally, that quote is in the trial. At any rate, suddenly, her husband becomes very ill. And the maids, who all hated her with one exception, they'd all known his family forever, and two of them had tried to marry him. And anyway, they telegraphed to his brother in London, and he had a very prominent brother. Those of you who have ever sung in the church choir will know he was a composer, but his best known piece was called "The Holy City." Remember that? The side that's not tideless sea, the light of God was on his face, whatever. Anyway, he wrote that. It became hugely successful and very, very profitable. So the brother gets in the train immediately, comes up to Liverpool, says to all of the house servants, she's to give nothing to him. She's not even be able to go into his bedroom. And then he also called a local nurse and called her in to be at the bedside. And again, we know for a fact that from that point on, Flory never even gave her husband a glass of water. And that became a very, very important point. So anyway, all this time, the mother, Carrie, doesn't know what's going on. Somebody telegraphs her in Paris. She comes rushing over. And on the day she arrives, her son-in-law had died the night before. James Maybrick had died. Two of his brothers were there. The nurse was there. And again, they're absolutely certain that Flory had not given him anything, but they gave her chlorine with that, something to knock her out, whatever the right term would be. It's a medicine. Chloral, thank you. And while she's out, they take her 2 children. They take her husband's body. She was not allowed to see either or to say goodbye. She was not allowed to go to the funeral. They promptly took her down to the jail to arrest her. Well, the problem with that was that the autopsy said there was virtually no arsenic in his body. There was trace amounts. And the brother said, I don't care. Changed the death certificate because they had written that he died of gastroenteritis. And so the doctor did, in fact, change it. And at this point, she's in jail. They come in and tell her, of course, that she's going to be tried for murder. And at this point, her mother, who does not have a lot of her own money, desperately starts trying to sell whatever she can to get money for an attorney, because she knows her daughter desperately is going to need it. So she became both fortunate and unfortunate in the choice of these two. Her attorney, Sir Charles Russell, became Lord Chief Justice of England after this. He was the most prominent attorney in the country, absolutely brilliant at what he did. He had just come off a very big win as well for a member of Parliament. And so in that regard, although he was very expensive, he was a good choice. Unfortunately, the judge appointed to her case was Sir James Stephen. But you probably have heard of his two nieces, Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. But his family, madness ran through his family. In fact, within 2 months of the end of this trial, he was actually placed into an asylum. And he died there a few months later. But you'll hear how that comes into the story in a minute. So as I said, she was very unfortunate in drawing him. So she gets to trial, and as I said, the autopsy had been changed at this point, the death certificate, even though there was just trace amounts. She was placed there, and it was a great society thing that people stood in line to get tickets to come in to have a seat to watch her. They were all very much in her favor. He was never liked anyway, but they also knew that she had not given him anything for 5 or 6 days. So in other words, it was physically impossible that she had murdered him, and yet she's here on trial for murder. The dailies, they were literally daily newspapers like this coming out with drawings from the court and all that sort of thing. And the reporters would run outside as soon as the session was over to use the telegraph to call in their particular story. Now, unfortunately, one of the maids who really disliked her had been given a letter. This was just days before the death of the husband. Had been given a letter to take to the post office, and it was to Mr. Brierly. It was to Alfred Brierly, the one she'd been in the hotel with. And the maid later said that she dropped it in the mud puddle. It was not raining that day. There was not even any showers. And she said she opened it so that she could put it in a clean envelope. It was a love letter to Brierly, basically saying, I'm virtually a prisoner here, my husband, please come, you must help me. And so when that was seen, of course, she gave it to the brother, the one who was running everything. So the nurse testified to it. But even on the stand, when her attorney said, was it raining that day? No. Well, you just said it was dropped in the mud. Oh, well, it was just dirty then. Really? Well, we have it right here. Here, show me where the dirt is on the envelope. Well, you must have brushed it off. I mean, on and on and on. And it was said locally in the paper that by the time she stepped down off the stand, no one would hire her for anything at all, given what she had done. So that happened. But at no point was anybody ever able to place Flory with any arsenic given to the husband. And everything would have been would have gone well, except the accused could give a 5-minute unsworn statement. Couldn't be cross-examined. Her attorney couldn't ask her the question. She just had to stand up on her own and do it. And she did. And she did a very good job until she got to the one place when she said, look, and the night that I made the drink for him, and he begged me to put the arsenic in it. She said, there was no one else, and I'm his wife, and he was begging me and saying, I've done this for years, it will not harm me, you must put it in. It's the one and only time anybody could put that in her hands, and she was the one who said it. Her attorney obviously should never, ever have allowed that. Well, anyway, yes.
Okay, you said that the doctors redid his death certificate, said there's no arsenic? Well, what's she being charged with? Killing by arsenic?
They said yes.
Well, if they said that the death certificate says no arsenic, how could she be charged?
I said it was changed, I remember. The original autopsy said there was only trace amounts.
Oh, okay.
And then the brother got them to change that to say that he had died of arsenic poisoning.
Oh, got it.
I'm sorry, my fault. I'm not clear. Anyway, so the jury goes out, but before that happens, the judge has to sum up, and remember what I told you about the judge earlier. He did it for 2 days. His summation took 2 entire days. On his first day, it was very clear that he was in favor of not convicting her. He went on and on about, she wasn't, no matter what she had, there's no question she didn't give him anything. You have to think about what she's been through. And by the way, she refused to let her attorney speak of the mistress because she said she didn't want to harm their children. Another big mistake as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, his whole first day of summing up, it was pretty obvious that he didn't think that she should be convicted. That night, he went to the Inns of Court in Liverpool, and one of the other judges there, who had a different case, was the son of Charles Dickens. And he heard him pacing down the hall that night, muttering to himself, "That woman is guilty. That woman is guilty," over and over and over. So he came in on the second day of summation, totally changed, and said, you must charge her on morality. Look what she did, Here's a woman who went out and spent 2 nights with a man in a hotel openly, didn't try to hide it, who's bought all of these dresses and gone into debt, and yet she goes out and does this to her poor sick husband who's home alone when she should have been there taking care of him, and yet anyway, he did this whole thing. Totally changed from the first day. So the jury goes out for only 38 minutes. But during that time, one of her American attorneys, who supposedly was working on the land deal, was led down to where she was being held and said, "You must sign this right away." And she said, "I can't sign anything right now. We're about to go to the verdict." And he said, "No, if you are convicted, your signature will not be legal. So you must sign it right now." And she said, "What is it?" And he said, "Don't worry, She signed away all of the acreage, all the millions of acres that she was due. Anyway, the jury comes back and did basically what the judge told them they had to do, and they said so afterwards. They said, "We followed his instructions." They found her guilty of murder. She was promptly sentenced to death by hanging, and the people who were in the courtroom were outraged, and they actually started booing and hissing the judge. He had to be protected by police as he left, and yet they were all cheering for Florida. The night before she was supposed to be hanged in 7 days' time, the night before she was to be hanged, they commuted the sentence, and there's several attorneys here. You'll appreciate this. They changed the conviction to attempted murder. She wasn't tried for attempted murder. She was tried for murder in the first degree and found guilty. But the most important thing that happened was that Queen Victoria, like nothing more than her role as the widow of Windsor, this very sad widow with all the children missing Prince Albert, she said that any woman who would commit adultery, as she had admitted, deserved to die. And then she said, however, since the testimony showed that, she said technically, and she used that word, technically she didn't kill him, meaning that they know in those last several days she'd not given him anything, that she would commute it to life imprisonment. But she actually wrote, "But so long as I live, she should never be released." So they took her immediately. She was in prison for 15 years. In the first 9 months, she was in solitary confinement. Didn't see a single person during all that time. She was at this point early 30s. Yeah, very early 30s. She was not allowed to write anything to her children or whatever. She even tried to write to her brother-in-law to say, "Would you please send this to my children?" And he finally told her, "You will never see your children again." They've even changed their last names. Finally, when she could start having visitors, she could only have 2 a month for half an hour at a time. Her mother had moved to France because it cost much less to live in a tiny little village in the north part of France. But she would take the boat over twice a month. She never missed a time in 15 years of coming to see her, even though she was desperately poor as well. In the early days, remember I told you there was a son. He'd been born before the little girl. He was in medical school in Paris, and he died of consumption. So here's the mother left alone. The fortune's gone, her daughter's in prison, the 2 grandchildren have been taken away, and she can't see them at all. It was a pretty desperate situation, as you can imagine. She did at one point try something. Some people thought it was an attempted suicide. Others thought that it was just a dumb move on her part. But she was sent back to solitary for another 6 months as a result of that. But then she became a good prisoner. At that point, she never complained. She did all that she was told. She had to sew shirts all day long. And if she didn't make enough shirts in her quota, they could take her food away. She also had no medical attention. She lost all of her teeth, 15 years, because they didn't give prisoners dental care of any kind. And so finally, Queen Victoria dies. Her son Edward VII comes to the throne, and all this while, there had been this great letter writing campaign on her behalf by the women of America, including the First Lady, Mrs. Harrison, including several wives of the cabinet members. They were all writing, begging that she be released, that she be given justice, and they even wrote directly to Queen Victoria when she was still alive, and she was furious that they would do so. She said that it was a high presumption for them to think they could write directly to the Queen, even if they were the First Lady and a member of the cabinet. So anyway, Edward comes to the throne, and so they thought she'll be released right away, and they came back and said, well, no, it has to be long enough to look like it wasn't just because the Queen didn't want her to be released. So they had her stay another year after Edward came to the throne. So after 15 years, they released her. She, of course, came out, at this point, she's only in her 40s, but you can imagine how haggard she would look after all that length of time, losing her teeth and all that. She promptly came back to the United States. There were all those women who had been her champions in the States, arranged for it all. She came back, and she went to stay at the Moraine Hotel, which is in Highland Park, Illinois. There's her signature up on the top. It was a very nice, elegant place to stay because she was signed up for a speaking tour, a very successful speaking tour. She talked about rehabilitation. She talked about what we do to women in prison. She was very elegant, very articulate, and she was very successful at doing it. She was also being paid to do this as well because, of course, she had no money, as you can imagine. So she's tucking away a nest egg, and she kept telling her mother, I'm going to make enough for us to buy a house, and I'm going to take care of you since all those 15 years, you never left me during any of that time. Well, she unfortunately read in the newspaper one day that her mother had gone back to Paris unannounced and died without a penny, died as a pauper to be buried next to her son, the one who'd been in medical school in Passy Cemetery. So at this point, the last photograph that was ever made of Caroline, obviously not a particularly good one either, but she had a very, very difficult life, as you can imagine. Well, anyway, so here's the daughter back in the States. She does well. She goes on these speaking lecture circuits. She had someone investing her money for her. You can imagine what happened, right? Lost everything. Lost everything. She had nowhere to go. So she went back to the Moraine Hotel, the one I showed you, and because the owner had been so kind to her. And she said, I can't pay you, but if you will take up what's left of our family lawsuit, of all that acreage, because there was some of it that was still in litigation after all this time, then you can have half of whatever you get, and that will pay you off. And he said himself later that he wasn't just being kind; he thought there really would be something coming from this. So she stayed there at the hotel, but when nothing happened, when they were finally told, the last appeal went when they said, your family hasn't even paid taxes in 20 years on this property. It does not belong to you. I mean, all of the squatters' rights and all that sort of thing. So at that point, she sort of thought that her travails were over. She'd never seen or heard from her children, but her son, who's the one in the center without the hat, the sort of attractive young one, he had gone to Canada. He had gotten his degree in engineering. He'd gone there as a metallurgist and chemical engineer, right barely on the Canadian side, just over from Washington State. He was at his desk one day, working, having lunch, having his sandwich in one hand, supposedly a glass of water in the other, when he reached for the wrong one drank the beaker and it was poison. And he died. Within an hour. She was still alive, the mother was still alive when somebody found her and said, "What do you think about that?" She said, "My children have been dead to me for decades." And he did have a sister. She married, never had children, so that line completely died out. But anyway, he was buried in Canada. And what's interesting is, I love doing research. When I tracked all this down, he was buried under the assumed name that he'd been given when he was taken away from his mother. He was buried under that name. When I finally found him and knew who he was, the local newspaper there did not know that's who it was. So it's sort of fun to let them know that.
Where is he buried? Where in Canada?
I'll have to look at, I can find the name of the town in the book. It's a small town just above Washington State.
British Columbia somewhere?
Yeah, exactly. But again, I can find the name of it. So anyway, what's she gonna do? She has no money. She has no one left in the world. Poor Flory, she had tiny bit of money left. She went to a tiny little town in Connecticut on the Housatonic River. Someone got her a job as a maid. She's terrible at it. She'd never been a maid. She'd had servants, and then she'd been in prison for 15 years. So she was promptly fired. She hadn't told anyone who she was. She was using her maternal grandmother's maiden name, Ingraham. And finally, some people locally realized who she was and took pity on her, but would never say that they knew who she was. They wanted her to at least keep that bit of her pride. And there was a small boys' school close by. And those boys would come and do things like chop wood for her and all that. But they wouldn't go in the house because she had more than 20 cats. And it was a 2-room house without electricity or running water. And so they would not go inside it. But she was, as I said, at least the boys at the school were kind to her. And she would go once a year to their graduations, their award ceremony at the graduation. So she had that bit. So she died in 1947. She's buried there just under her initials, no name. So just when you think, oh good, they can sleep in peace, right? It's all over, and these poor people with this terrible story are all gone, right? Nope, not quite. In 1996, a diary was found in Liverpool, purporting to be the diary of of Jack the Ripper, written by her husband, the one who died, who was very clear in there. He even named his children. It wasn't even so he was trying to change the names or anything. And the last Jack the Ripper murder happened 3 weeks before his death. And of course, he used to go to London constantly to see his brother, to go to the doctors and all that sort of thing. Here's the problem with the provenance. No one can prove where it's been all those years. Some people say the paper is too late to be the right era. Others say no, it's not. Same thing with the ink. The ink has been conclusively proven to be from the 1940s, and yet another one will say no, it's from the 1860s. And, back and forth. So, but if you go to Google right now and look up the most likely suspects for Jack the Ripper, James Maybrick is one of them. But the other is his brother, the composer, who was a big Mason, the Masons are an organization. And supposedly that whole theory is all wrapped up with masonry. But
Were we always told that Jack the Ripper was a surgeon? I mean,
yeah, because he
yes, the way, the surgical.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the suspects was indeed a butcher.
So
but-
someone had no anatomy, is what they've always told us in Whitechapel.
Exactly.
That doesn't really make sense.
Exactly, but again, nobody else does either. If you look at the list, everybody has some problem with them. But at any rate, this just brought the whole story forward again. And all of those terrible stories about Carrie originally were all reprinted. The Mobile paper, again, this woman who murdered and taught her own daughter to murder. I mean, all over again in the late 1990s. And then that of course is picked up and printed elsewhere. And nobody ever goes back and does the retraction. Yes, ma'am.
Who was the lawyer that went to her in prison and got her to sign over
his name comes to me in a minute, starts with K. But he, they went after him afterwards, of course, saying that he couldn't do this and it was an ethical violation and all that sort of thing. And it kept me going further and further up the ladder, knowing though that she had no more money. And after a while, she just couldn't pursue this because no attorney was gonna do anything. And he ended up, she did finally get a judgment against him, but she never collected a penny of it. Because as you know, you can get a judgment against somebody, but then getting that money is something else.
He wasn't a bacon lawyer, was he?
You can see why I don't practice law anymore. I'm a recovering attorney, and one of my law school classmates is here too. I love questions though, so I know that's a lot of information to take in, so let me see about your questions.
All right, so the connection she has to make is that she came here and married the naval officer and stayed here for about
9 months.
So no, only 9 months?
And that was when he was supervising the building of the laboratory. He said, next time you go out, find it. Notice it on the right side where Chichester was. But yeah, that was her connection here.
But so he was her second murder and he got married at sea.
Right, exactly.
According to the paper.
According to the paper, that she killed him at sea, that's right. What else?
Do you think the gold watch was legitimate that they found?
I'm sorry?
Jack the Ripper watch?
Look, interesting, go into detail of this in the book. They did find a watch, and they're not sure exactly its provenance either. But James Maverick's best friend, who was there with him when he died, James had given him his own gold watch. And 3 years later, that best friend committed suicide by walking in the ocean, but he took the watch off and left it on the shore. And there's some feeling that perhaps that was where that watch came from. But again, I don't pretend to be a Jack the Ripper expert, and if you go to the official Jack the Ripper forum website, all they do is fight. You know, it's like one person saying it absolutely is this, and then the next three will say it's been proven not to be that. So, but the watch certainly does play.
Supposedly the watch had the initials of the victims.
Exactly, that was the Maverick watch. It actually has scratched into it his initials plus the date of the deaths. That watch absolutely is the one that we're talking about, yeah. But again, somebody else said, oh no, those scratches were done much later, and then others have said, no, those are of the period as well. So it's the same thing we do in court today, we just have two different experts testifying against one another.
Any final questions?
Back to the Scion Bible about the laboratory. There used to be a two-story wooden building, a bike shop was in it a long time ago. And I thought that was something from the Civil War also, that structure there. I don't know if you'll know this or not.
Where was it?
It was right there at that corner of the Circle and Bible, right behind where that historical marker is.
Well, the laboratory itself, which is pictured in here, sorry, wrong way, was behind where Jim Shaw's is. In fact, the photograph of it I had to track down. It ended up being at the Washington Library, but it was mislabeled.
So close to where Payne City is. Is that
Yes,
correct?
exactly. You know where all the ball fields are back there and everything. Well, thanks much. If you want to ask anything, I'll still be here.